Hey, this is Paul. Thought I'd maybe make a quick member video on what did Jordan call it? The foreshadowing. It's basically the first chapter of We Who Wrestle with God. I did a bunch of chores today and did some garage cleaning out, and that meant running in e-waste and some old paint and stuff, and then I had to make an Amazon return, so I knew I'd have a hour or so behind the wheel just driving to different places. So I started out listening to Sean McDowell's video that he released a couple of days ago on a little review of We Who Wrestle With God. He did it with a guy who he often does things with, and so I listened to a little bit. I thought, I thought Sean McDowell had a good I thought he had a good, insightful take on Peterson generally, and they started into the book, and I thought, well, it's I've probed into it, and I thought, well, this is a good opportunity for me to just probe into a little bit more, and so I listened to what's basically the first chapter, even though it's not chapter 1. He starts out laying out, I would say, the new epistemological frontier and the realities of it. And these are, if you have any understanding of what's been happening in the corner, what's happened with Vervaeke and Peterson in particular, understanding that what recent developments in psychology and philosophy and cognitive science have pushed towards is, again, the realization that we live in too big a world, and most of the reduction that we do so preconsciously. And then Peterson steps into that and says, this is basically governed by narrative and by story. And so that's of course, in some ways, the first big insight, the first big provocation that breaks us from modernity. Now, this isn't a departure from postmodernity, and I continue to have Damon Walter in the back of my mind, suggesting to me that Peterson has never really left postmodernity, and I think he has a point in that. And because in some ways, the deeper Peterson goes, the more he gives postmodernity its due. But then the argument is, are we really sort of on the frontier of metamodernity? Because those who sort of embrace postmodernity took it in a very different direction than Peterson, who is sort of a traditionalist. So the first part of the chapter, he talks about, let's say, the epistemic break with modernity. And then he goes into Elijah and the story of Elijah. And he deals with the Elijah as he usually deals with almost every biblical story, sort of archetypally. And in that archetypal approach, it's very much, let's say, God number one, general revelation. Okay, and all the way back to Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, I noticed Jordan Peterson was bringing back God number one. This is the God of general revelation. And so he uses the Elijah story basically in some ways to give an apology for conscience as a valid source of moral intuition via general revelation. And he does this with the story of Elijah running from the prophets of Baal, and God was not in the earthquake, God was not in the whirlwind, God was in the still small voice. He sort of quickly connects the still small voice with conscience, and in some ways divinizes conscience. And I remember him doing this quite a bit right after he sort of came out of the akathisia in some of the early days when he returned from his illness. That was a big theme. And usually what Jordan does with his books is he's sort of always writing it, and so you sort of have the divination of conscience. And at the end of the book, again, at the end of the chapter, there's sort of an apology once more for the Bible is the foundation of Western civilization, and because Western civilization is the best civilization, and he would argue it's the best civilization because this is the civilization people want to get to. This is the most dominant civilization. Again, this is very much a Darwinian truth approach. He says, okay, so the Bible's the foundation of this, so we should prioritize the Bible. And so, again, there's sort of three segments in this pre-chapter 1, which is really a chapter in and of itself. I'll see as I get through the book how much, sometimes in an introduction, he didn't name it an introduction, but in an introduction, you basically use the rest of the book to flesh out. Maybe you have the argument in small form in your introduction. Many books do that. A few points on this. If there can be guilt by association, there can also be assimilation by association. And in some ways, I wondered about his use of the Elijah story to make this point. Because what you really don't want to do is violate the Elijah story in order to make the point. And you certainly can't say that the Elijah story is, that its meaning is arbitrary, or you're really in postmodern territory. So, and what jumped out at me with respect to the Elijah story was, weren't the prophets of Baal also moving under the dictates of conscience? Wasn't Jezebel also, and Ahab also, weren't they also moving under the dictates of conscience? Deep in the narrative of the Old Testament is the assertion that the God of Israel has priority over the other gods. And while I'm not saying that Jordan Peterson would disagree with that, the climax of the story is, of course, the showdown on Mount Carmel, the slaughter of the prophets of Baal, and then the prophesied destruction of the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. And of course, Jehu will be the hand of that. So on one hand, it's not an unwelcome thing to, in that sense, bring back an enchanted world, one where God speaks through conscience. And I'm not going to argue that God doesn't speak through conscience. But is conscience itself and alone sufficient to sort of leave? Is that sufficient for your message? There's a lot going on here. And so Jordan, again, I think is generally speaking making an apology for God, number one, against the new atheists. But as I've mentioned in some previous videos, just because we are sort of leaving the epistemic world of modernity, and I think Jordan aptly in the early parts of the chapter lays that out, doesn't mean that the much more perennial challenges we face about the formation of our consciences, part of what it seems to me psychology, sociology, and the science of formation suggest is that the divination of conscience is something that we ought to not move towards too quickly, because everyone's going to have a conscience. And it was, in fact, this kind of pluralism that the old ways, now in recession but not completely subsumed of rationality and empiricism were designed to help people get through. Now, of course, before that, the turning to the text, it was a commitment to the authority of Scripture, to use the Bible as the formation of our consciences, as the guide to our consciences, as the guide in the world. Now, again, Jordan isn't antithetical to this, but I think, again, his major project is fundamentally general revelation and maybe special revelation, but to what degree we still haven't really managed pluralism, which is sort of the large question that pervasive interpretive pluralism, as Christian Smith called it in his book, The Bible Made Impossible. So that's one point. Another point, Jordan Peterson as an author. It's interesting, the difference between writing and speaking. There's no question Jordan is a compelling speaker. And I think his best mode is his professorial lecture mode. Now, I haven't gone into Peterson Academy, and so I haven't seen his new classes, but I think, again, at least out on open internet, some of his best material has long been his classroom lectures. I think there's a certain discipline that those classroom lectures require of him, and he rises to the challenge. I think he's an outstanding lecturer. Whether Peterson Academy can sort of do that for him in the way that, let's say, an established public university did that for him, we'll see. But, I'm also listening to Spencer Klavin's book. Jordan as a writer is, he's a scientist. And in some ways, not unlike a lot of the theology that's been written over the last couple hundred years, a lot of the modernist theology, he tries to approach it as a scientist. And Spencer Klavin is a poet. And it really shows in the writing. I'm not saying Jordan is a bad writer, but it's hard sledding. I'll say it that way. It's hard sledding. So I was just driving around, and I knew that, pull into the garage, deal with dinner, talk to the other peeps in my house, all of the ideas that are fresh in my mind after listening to the chapter, they would float away. So good opportunity to make a little members video. So again, members, thank you for your support, and onward and upward.